So what happens when Naughty Dog starts a side project that's mechanically identical to Uncharted, but at the same time entirely opposite to Uncharted thematically? What happens when that same side project isn't just well received, but rises to an almost mythic status among audiences? What happens when this darker, grittier younger brother to Uncharted inadvertently becomes the pinnacle of everything the studio has been building to for the last generation? Is there any room left for Uncharted to grow? Can this pulpy, action-fueled franchise still be taken seriously in the shadow of its brooding younger brother? Can Uncharted survive now that its own digital re-release has reminded people that this perfect franchise isn't actually as perfect as people remember? As you can imagine, this kinda put Naughty Dog in an awkward spot, as they no longer have to create a sequel to a game, but a sequel to the abstract idea of a game. And they have to release this sequel after what many are calling their magnum opus. They have to release it to a gaming public that has become skeptical of the pervasive Uncharted formula, to an industry so affected by Uncharted that in the time it took them to create this sequel, they've already begun to deconstruct the series' shortcomings. They have to please a core audience of fans while impressing those brought to the studio by The Last of Us. Oh, yeah, and it's a new console generation, so they have to reintroduce the series to people getting a PlayStation for the first time while showing off what they can do with the new tech. And this is the definitive conclusion to a widely beloved franchise. Uncharted 4 is an impossible sequel. It's a game pulled in so many simultaneous directions that I'm surprised it has the tensile strength to stay together at all. And yet, despite all of this, it somehow managed to be a great game. Kinda. There's a crap ton going on under the hood of this mechanical marvel, so get comfortable, folks. This is gonna be a long one. Video games have always had a strained relationship with fun. Since a game is in the name, fun has always been the easiest and most obvious way to make a game engaging. There's nothing wrong with fun. Fun is great. But if video games can only ever be fun, then their reach as an art form is severely limited. This has led to an almost juvenile fascination with the dark and gritty. The problem is, developers aren't realizing that depth doesn't come from the dark and gritty or realistic. If depth came from darkness and despair, then hatred or manhunt would be our Citizen Kane. It doesn't matter how dark your subject matter is, if you have nothing to say about it, then your story will only ever be hollow. The Last of Us works because it's using its dark subject matter to examine the depravity of man, what makes us human, and the lengths people will go to defend their definition of humanity. Basically, what us means to them. At times its themes may be a tad simplistic and it may fall into one or two too many zombie movie cliches, but these horror elements are all in service to an overall more contemplative narrative. And really, that's all Naughty Dog wanted to do with The Last of Us. They wanted to tell a compelling story and not have to worry about developing pesky mechanics or unique gameplay. So they just took the framework from the Uncharted series and slapped it on a zombie movie and called it a day. And it worked. While the gameplay was criticized for being bland and generic, the story ended up being so strong that it carried the game on its own in many people's eyes. This, however, created a rather large, unforeseen problem for Nathan Drake. You see, now that they had shown what they can do with the Uncharted formula, people now expected Nathan Drake to inherit The Last of Us's gritty tone, because to the wider gaming public, more darker still equals more better. And to them, The Last of Us will always be superior to Uncharted 2 because of its darker tone and not because of Uncharted 2's flawed character motivation. People were hungry for Nate to become Joel. The only problem is, Nate fundamentally cannot be Joel. It'd be like Disney making a gritty reboot of Indiana Jones where he's a wife-beating alcoholic. Nobody wants to see that. So if Uncharted 4 isn't a gritty reboot of the series, then what is it? Well, just like all the other games in the Uncharted series, the dramatic question lies right in the title. Drake's Fortune is simply introducing you to the fortune-filled world of Nathan Drake and its lovable cast of thieves. Among Thieves is simply asking if there is honor among these thieves and what separates Nate from the mercenaries he's gunning down. Drake's Deception is about fear and the lies we tell ourselves. The Golden Abyss is about, Golden Abysses? Okay, look, no one actually bought a PS Vita, so we'll probably never know for sure. And finally, Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, asks us to look at Nate through the eyes of others and asks if he really deserves a happy ending at all. The big idea Naughty Dog really plays with in Uncharted 4 is the third-person perspective. Video games have long struggled to figure out how the third-person perspective should be used in storytelling or gameplay. It doesn't have the intimacy of the first-person perspective, and it doesn't have the detachment of a top-down perspective. So, the third-person perspective has just been a sort of lazy default, used for little more than clunky cover mechanics. Naughty Dog, however, uses the third-person perspective similar to how a novel uses third-person. The beginning of Uncharted 4 displaces you by hopping from the middle of the game to Nate's childhood to shortly before the events of Drake's Fortune and then back to present day. For the first time in the series, cutscenes display what's happening outside of Nate's perspective. Nate is constantly hearing about events that are happening just out of his reach, or seeing things happen that he is unable to stop, showing how Nate is removed from the action just as the player is removed from Nate. They even start to get meta in the chapter A Normal Life when Nate plays Crash Bandicoot. You're controlling Nate, who's controlling Crash. And that same game of Crash Bandicoot is part of a larger game between Nate and Elena about who will get to do the dirty dishes. And that game in itself is part of the game you're playing. Okay, it's really like, whew. Perhaps the biggest shift in perspective comes from the prison break and the epilogue. In the chapter Hector Alcazar, Sam explains to Nate how he manages to escape the Panamanian prison he's been trapped in for all this time. However, instead of being told through cutscenes, you play as Sam and break out of the prison yourself. This small change in perspective shows that Nate still yearns for adventure and is more or less living vicariously through his brother's tale. They then pay this off in the game's third act with the chapter No Escape, which borrows elements from the prison break, showing that Sam's self-destructive actions have more or less created a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the epilogue, you play as Nate and Elena's daughter, in a chapter that's almost a one-to-one mirror image of the chapter A Normal Life, with the two chapters being used to show what Nate's been up to in the intermediate time. And while these sudden changes in perspective may seem simple or sloppy, they are actually in service to a complex meta-narrative. Naughty Dog is asking you to step back from Nate and question power fantasies themselves. Characters within the game tell of Nate's previous adventures, posing the question of whether power fantasies really should be praised. Rafe, the main antagonist, is even set up as a spoiled rich kid who is jealous of Nate and is ultimately destroyed by that same jealousy. This asks if it's even healthy to pursue power fantasies, and a whole mess of questions about video gaming's obsession with power fantasies that are way too complex for me to talk about here, so we'll be getting to them closer to the end of the video. Naughty Dog's experimentation with the third-person camera is fascinating, and I'm excited to see what they do with it next. That being said, how it's used at the start of the game is kinda sloppy. I understand that Uncharted was trying to get you right into the action with the boat chase, but other than being a clever reversal of Uncharted 1's tutorial level, it adds little to the story. It's not at Nate's low point like a rock in a hard place, it doesn't establish character like Another Round, and it doesn't introduce you to any mechanics that could have just as easily been introduced later on in the game. While we're on the topic, I really wish they would have handled Nate's childhood flashbacks a little better as well. They were two solid levels, don't get me wrong, but when the first flashback is chapter 1 and the second flashback is chapter 16, it's gonna be pretty jarring to players. Do you know what would have been great? If the game began with the lore of adventure. This would show fans of the series that this was different than previous Uncharted games, while putting new players in the spot of young Drake, experiencing Uncharted's world for the first time, just as Sam is slowly introducing this world to young Nate. And then once that was over, cut to adult Nate getting punched in the face a la The Last Crusade, then cut back to the second childhood flashback, the brothers Drake, after Sam's been shot. This could be Nate's way of remembering all the fun times he had with his brother, making the chapter all the more bittersweet. The chapter even ends with a roll credits moment.
You're serious, aren't you?
Nathan, we were meant for this. And I promise, you and me together, we're gonna go far. So what do you say? Nathan Drake?
We would have seen Sam act selfishly as a kid, thus making the reveal that he never really grew up all the more tragic. And it would have freed up more time for Elena and Nate to smooth things over, potentially making the uplifting ending a little less jarring. And yes, I know that them downplaying Sully's role in turning Nate into a treasure hunter and retconning Nate's lineage to Sir Francis Drake rustled a few jimmies. But honestly, this makes Nate's character even more complex. We learned in Uncharted 3 that Nate is basically just a kid running scared, so it makes sense for him to basically be playing pretend with a false name for a decade or two. Besides, why wouldn't he give a false name to a man he hardly knows? A man that he thought just a few minutes ago was trying to kill him. Plus, it ties in nicely with Sully's line on true greatness, and marks a shift in Nate's character from an orphan who lets others make decisions for him to someone who takes charge of his own life. And while I may be disappointed with Uncharted 4's sloppy start, there's no denying that once this game gets going, it really gets going. Uncharted 4's pace is relentless. You'll be learning new mechanics and adapting to new enemy types all the way until the last level. And many of these mechanics will come back and start working together with other mechanics in really interesting ways. The most notable pair being climbing and shooting. I have no idea why these two weren't combined earlier in the series. I mean, they tried to do something like it in Uncharted 3, but the vast vertical firefights of Uncharted 4 feel much more natural and more interesting than anything the series has done so far. The grappling hook and climbing spike add some much needed variety to the previously bland climbing of the series. The gunplay and combat have been polished to a near mirror shine, and the stealth, well, let's talk about stealth. Stealth has never been the series' strong suit. The previous games insisted that it was somehow possible if you happened to press the right button on the third evening of a blue moon. However, Uncharted 4 is the first game in the series where stealth is a credible strategy. And when I say credible, I mean the only strategy. This game will often use stealth as a crutch, de-incentivizing the run-and-gun gameplay the series was known for. I'm all for a game that wants the player to play in a specific way. However, it's incredibly frustrating to see a level seemingly laid out to accommodate different playstyles, only to be punished for doing anything other than stealth. Especially since the advertising and previous entries in the series insist this playstyle is acceptable. You'll find yourself trying to grapple over a trench to throw a machine gunner off a cliff, then shoot an exploding barrel while sliding down to cover on a ledge, and then get one shot by a sniper you couldn't see because you didn't press the roll button every 2 seconds like you were supposed to. So you go back to the bland cover shooting and stealth. But then you get to the finale of the game, Keep Moving, where they suddenly expect you to know how to run and gun despite being encouraged to spend the whole game cowering behind a chest-high wall waiting for Nadine's big bad men to go away. I mean, it's not a deal breaker or anything, and I'm sure some of you weren't even bothered by this, but it really grinded my gears. The gunplay may be noticeably slower this time around, but the story isn't. Hopping from a high-class black market auction to the Irish countryside to Madagascar, Savannah, and many, many more locations. And while this easily could have felt self-indulgent or exhausting, it's Naughty Dog's love of symmetry that holds the whole thing together. The entire game is anchored in an exhaustively meticulous mirrored structure that not only keeps the whole story from derailing itself, but also serves as a clever way of celebrating the previous Uncharted games. A Normal Life mirrors the epilogue. The Prison Break mirrors the chapter No Escape. Nate's first fight with Nadine is subverted at the top of the second act. You think you'll be able to take Nadine now that Sam's at your side, but instead you discover that Sam was never really on your side. He was doing this all for himself. At the start of the adventure, you overhear Nadine hitting on Rafe. At the end of the adventure, you overhear Rafe hitting Nadine. At the start of the first act, you play a flashback of Nate's past. At the start of the third act, you play another flashback. In A Normal Life, Elena and Nate play Crash Bandicoot. In the chapter For Better or Worse, they play Crash Bandicoot again, but this time with significantly higher stakes than Dirty Dishes. There are these chapters that serve as greatest hits albums of the series. The chapter For Better or Worse is a compilation of Elena and Nate's relationship. Hidden in Plain Sight revisits the clockwork platforming from Uncharted 2 before becoming a celebration of Uncharted's car chases and perhaps the best set piece in the entire series. Nate's fight with Nadine is a subversion of the giant fight in another round. The tutorial level is even a payoff to a near-decade-old joke.
Yeah, so unless you want to end up in a Panamanian jail, we should probably handle this ourselves.
Well, what's worse?
You obviously haven't been in a Panamanian jail.
Not to mention that Avery's descent is a mirror of Heart of Ice and The Bunker, where instead of discovering some spooky supernatural twist, you discover the even creepier insanity of Henry Avery. Something I forgot to discuss in my video on Uncharted's character writing is that storylines or subplots can serve as foils as well. You often see this in stories that are plays within plays, where the story the actor is telling mirrors what's going on in his personal life. But here it's taken to a whole nother level, as the story of Henry Avery mirrors the story of Burns' grandson, which in turn mirrors Nate's journey through the game and the player's relationship to Nathan Drake. And while the parallels between them range from subtle to mind-numbingly obvious, the attention to detail is fairly impressive. They hide Henry Avery's insanity behind the romantist pop culture idea of piracy and the idea of a righteous thief in St. Dismas. A righteous thief, after all, is how Nate views himself, making the comparison between the two seem all the more apt. Then they pull the rug out from under the player as you start to uncover what really happened in Libertalia. Avery's descent may seem cheap or over the top, but it's actually not too far from how real pirates acted. Pirates were essentially just drunk sailors with little to no combat training, so they often relied on brute force and wanton acts of brutality to terrorize their opponents into submission. It wasn't too uncommon for these acts to be used on their own crew as a way of keeping them in line. The most successful pirate of all time, Chang Shi, was known to cut off her own men's heads and throw them to sharks for even the simplest of infractions. This eye for historical detail made Libertalia seem much more convincing than previously collapsed civilizations in the series. Whether it be convoluted traps, the obscure or otherwise unmentioned reasons for why these places collapsed, I never really felt like Shambhala or Aram of the Pillars were places people once lived. You can tell that every corner of Libertalia was painstakingly created. The broken barricades, the signs of a bloody revolution, the horses that died in their stables. It all works together to make a convincingly eerie atmosphere that challenges the characters as much as it does the players. I do, however, feel that some of the journal entries scattered about were a bit overkill. But despite being cliched and at times a little on the nose, overall the story they told was captivating and prompted me to explore Libertalia further. Then we get to the treasure. I loved the more realistic tone they took with Avery's gold. They didn't give it a supernatural twist, and yet Avery's gold ended up being a more creepy treasure than any other in the series. They made greed the big scary monster. Greed permeated every character's ambitions to the point where the gold felt more like a curse than an end goal. It ate at the insides of everyone that sought the treasure. It killed the citizens of Libertalia, and it almost destroyed Sam and Nate. And I guess I can't beat around the bush any further. Let's talk about Sam. The reveal of a long-lost brother is one of the most tired soap opera cliches out there, but somehow they managed to make Sam feel genuine to the world of Uncharted, and it certainly didn't hurt that they got Troy Baker for the role. His chemistry with Nolan North is superb, and watching two of the best voice actors of our generation play off each other was almost worth the price of admission in itself. Sam is all of Nate's selfish, destructive actions rolled up into a person, and somehow they managed to do that without making him feel over the top, or having his reveal be mustache-twirlingly villainous. He's not evil, he's just misguided, making it all the more fitting that at the end of the game, Sully takes him under his wing and straightens him out, just like how he did with Nate. Through visual motifs, smart game design, and player motivation, they managed to make Nate's relationship with this walking pile of cliches feel genuine. Throughout the game, Sam will help you get up onto a tall ledge or help you with a tricky bit of platforming by lending you a hand. This mechanical motif establishes a bond between the two brothers, but at the end of the game, when it comes time for you to return the favor, Sam rejects your helping hand, choosing to go after the treasure. This breaks the bond between the two brothers and shows that when it comes down to it, the gold is more important to Sam than his own brother. As a kid, you see Nate chasing after his older brother, riding on his motorcycle and getting him into trouble. As an adult, you see that nothing has changed. You're still chasing after your brother, you still ride his bike, and you're still getting into trouble because of him. The chapter titled Brother's Keeper is a direct reference to the biblical story of Cain and Abel. Nate, just like Abel, is willing to stick out his neck for Sam. However, Sam isn't willing to sacrifice for Nate. And considering how, spoiler alert, Cain murders Abel, you wonder if Nate will ultimately be killed by a brother who doesn't want his help. Naughty Dog keeps the player willing to sacrifice for Sam by tying these sacrifices to player motivation. Sure, the game begins with a bang, but after the dust settles, you play through a slowly plotted chapter called A Normal Life, in which Sam is introduced to the wonders of paperwork, small talk, and video games. By the time Sam shows back up, you no longer care about the cliches. You just want to get back to blowing stuff up. The game then challenges this desire in Act 2 when Elena calls you out on it. Nate, and by extension the player, were doing this to satisfy their need for adventure first, and for Sam second. Then in Act 3, when Sam betrays Nate and Elena comes to bail him out, Nate is forced to think back on his selfish actions. That being said, I kinda wish that they would have spent a bit more time having Nate smooth things over with Elena and Sully. Elena has had the thankless job of playing the adult for the entire series, and she is repaid by being abandoned in every Uncharted game. Don't believe me? Uncharted 1, Elena is viewed as a nuisance for most of the game, despite showing that she can hold her own, and Nate is constantly trying to get her off the island. And yeah, this is kinda justified by her being a reporter, but Uncharted 2, when Elena attempts to help Nate with his foolish mission to rescue a woman who just put a gun to his head, she is told that it's too dangerous for her, despite the fact that she ultimately is the one who bails him out and is the reason he even lived long enough to get on the train. And while you could argue that they give her a bigger role in the game's third act to compensate, this is somewhat diminished when in Uncharted 3, for the second time in the series, Elena and Nate's relationship has hit the reset button, and the two are unwilling to even talk to each other due to off-screen marital problems. Then when it turns out that they need her help, Elena accommodates them by guiding them through a country they know nothing about, teaching them about the customs, providing them with the proper paperwork, and helping them get out of a few sticky situations. Then she is abandoned by a drug-addled Nate and is forced to watch Sully kidnapped right in front of her, before Nate returns just to abandon her all over again for another suicide mission. And yet she is told the mission is too dangerous for her again, despite the fact that, again, Elena bails him out and is the only reason he even made it on the plane in the first place. Elena is then absent for the first and third acts of the game, but despite all of this, she and Nate ride off into the sunset anyway, despite the fact that they haven't addressed any of the issues between them. And then, Uncharted 4, Elena is left alone playing Crash Bandicoot for weeks on end while Nate is on the Malaysia job, when she discovers that Nate has been lying to her and instead having a treasure hunting affair with some creep in a jean jacket, she confronts Nate. Nate then blows her off and instead chooses to ride away onto some boat. And yet, despite all of this, she still follows him to Libertalia with Sully, fishes him out of some river, and then nurses him back to health while he rambles on about that time he and his brother broke into a woman's house and gave her a heart attack. I'm not exaggerating. Okay, maybe a little. But the point is that Elena has kind of been treated like garbage. They try to rectify this with the chapter For Better or Worse, which explores the two's relationship through clever gunplay and puzzles. The two balance each other out and work as a fantastic team. Plus, the individual sections of the level serve as the greatest hits album for their relationship. They steal a Jeep, just like in, well, about every Uncharted game. They have a vertical gunfight similar to the street sign one in Uncharted 2. Elena uses the Jeep to clear barricades like in Uncharted 2. They navigate a flooded city like in Uncharted 1. And the Jeep trail at the end mirrors the path of the first car chase of the series. I'll admit that some of the disagreements between them can be chalked up to action movie cliches. But I really wish Elena had gotten a little meaner or Nate been a little more earnest in his apology. It would have made the uplifting turn the ending took feel a bit more earned. And speaking of which, let's talk about the ending. If you haven't played Uncharted 4 yet, then, well, what are you doing here? I mean, I've pretty much spoiled the entire rest of the game already, so you might as well stick around. Well, continuing. At the end of the second act, Nate and Sam are shipwrecked on an island with no food, limited ammunition, and everyone on it wants to kill them. Even climbing, the easiest part of any Uncharted game, becomes laborious as the landscape becomes more treacherous and Nate becomes more injured, culminating in the chapter Marooned, where Nate literally hits rock bottom. Then you find out that Sam has lied to you, and Nate almost drowns after finding out that he just betrayed everyone in his life for nothing. But then Elena comes back, and everything becomes a fun summer blockbuster again, and Nate rides off into the sunset. Like I said at the start of the video, I don't have a problem with games that choose to be uplifting. I don't even have a problem with the epilogue. It showed that Nate had finally matured, and it gave him a proper send-off. What I do have a problem with is most of the third act. Everyone just forgives Nate for being an absolute jerk, they laugh off Sam's betrayal, and they brush aside the fact that his actions almost got them all killed for nothing. Like I said, I like that Sully takes Sam under his wing and that Nate finally gets a chance to mature, but they kinda threw the baby out with the bathwater here. The rest of the game was a darker, deconstructionist look at the Uncharted games and the characters we have come to love. Why do you think they added so many hours of boring driving and wandering around? Naughty Dog wanted to give players one more chance to hang out with these classic characters. But right after Sam betrays you, all of that great character writing is thrown out. I wanted to see Sam have some sort of consequence for his actions. I wanted Nate to show that he had grown up a bit by apologizing to Sully and Elena, not just have him bailed out like usual. Meanwhile, this happy reunion is juxtaposed against dismemberment, murder, bloody revolution, backstabbings, murder, mutiny, insanity, domestic violence, and more murder. I understand it's a tough tightrope to walk with a series like Uncharted, and I appreciate that they tried to not go too dark. I just think that they could have incorporated some of these elements without being so abrasive. Like, what if Sam was still dead set on going after a treasure while he had a broken leg and everything was burning, and Nate just snaps and tells him off? We would finally get to see Nate standing up to his older brother and showing that he had overcome his childlike insecurities. And perhaps we could have a come to Jesus moment for Sam as he realizes that he is going to die if he keeps this up. And since Sam represents Nate's greed and ambition, this would have been a symbolic turning point for the both of them. The two brothers finally see each other eye to eye and they decide to stop chasing these reckless ambitions. And it would have made professional archaeologist Beach House Dad Nate that we see in the epilogue more believable. And I know this sounds like a lot, but it wouldn't even have to be that much. The Last Crusade did this in a single line of dialogue.
Indiana? Indiana? Let it go.
Or what if Nate allowed himself to be vulnerable with Elena and Sully? This would contrast the ending of Uncharted 3 by showing how far Nate has come and reinforce the game's theme of family. And they almost did just that at the start of Brother's Keeper, but Elena cuts him off and tells him to go after Sam. I understand the thought process here. They wanted to keep the tension up as you race towards the final level, but again, it wouldn't even have to be that much. It could have just been Nate telling them how much they mean to him. Or if you wanted to be a little jokey, have him say that he's only a hero because they keep bailing him out, and now it's time for him to return the favor for Sam. See, in one line of dialogue, I completed Nate's character arc and ratcheted up the tension for the final level as it now sounds like Nate is saying goodbye. It at times feels like the ending was part of an entirely different Uncharted game. And that's because it was. Uncharted 4 was in development hell for years. It was almost cancelled several times due to artistic differences, expensive reshoots, and the entire ending being rewritten partway through production. Neil Druckmann and Bruce Staley, the writers behind The Last of Us, were asked to join the Uncharted trilogy's writing team, Amy Hennig and Justin Richmond. However, the two teams began to butt heads over what the direction of the fourth installment should be, resulting in the original Uncharted writing team quitting the company entirely and The Last of Us team quitting the project partway through production due to burnout. Meaning that with half the game completed, they no longer had a writing team. Druckmann and Straley agreed to return to the game on the condition that they receive full creative control, having disliked Hennig's original vision for the game. Originally, Sam and Rafe would be antagonists, with Sam out for revenge on Nate after leaving him in a Panamanian prison, and Rafe, his old cell partner, being voiced by freaking Alan Tudyk. Over the course of the story, Nate would have healed his relationship with his brother and teamed up with him by the end to take down Rafe. Druckmann and Straley would completely recast and rewrite Sam and Rafe halfway through production, resulting in very expensive reshoots. They would redesign large portions of the game, such as the auction house, Madagascar, and St. Dismas' cathedral. They would completely rewrite the ending, and they would make this Nathan Drake's last adventure. It's a pretty crazy story, and if you want to know more, there's a book partially about it called Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, the triumphant, turbulent story behind how games are made. Overall, I agree with the changes Druckmann and Straley made. The only thing more cliche than a secret brother is an evil one. And while I'm absolutely heartbroken we couldn't have seen Alan Tudyk as Rafe, I'm happy with the direction they took with his character. He's unlike any Uncharted antagonist we've seen before. He's smart, but not physically imposing. He's dryly sarcastic and often will bite back when Nate quips. He has a quiet insanity about him, and the fact that he can go off at any moment makes him uniquely intimidating. I just kinda wish we could have seen more of him. Uncharted games have the same problem as Marvel movies, in that they spend so much time developing their central characters that they have little time to explore the villains. In previous Uncharted games, this wasn't much of a problem, but in this game, it's perhaps the biggest thing that holds it back. It's the difference between a character-driven story and an action-focused one. In an action-driven story, you're focused mainly on the cool things the characters are doing and less on the characters themselves. Sure, the characters might be interesting, but they're ultimately just reacting to what's going on around them. But in a character-driven story, it's the characters' interactions that take center stage, and any action is a direct result of what the main characters are doing. There's a reason why Nadine's betrayal is so satisfying. It's because you were the one that lit the fire under the bad guy's seat. You were the one that caused them to panic and turn on each other. You were the one that killed all her men. In previous Uncharted games, the bad guys always had a seemingly limitless army of mercenaries for you to mow down. But after no escape, it becomes abundantly clear that that was all she had. That was Nadine throwing the proverbial kitchen sink at you, and now she's all out of options. It's a hilarious reversal of audience expectation, it's a direct result of the player's actions, so it feels like a small victory, and it carries tangible consequences as you are now trapped in a room with a homicidal maniac. Which brings us back to Rafe. In an action-focused story, the villain is just a plot device used to justify a string of set pieces, hence the limitless army of mercenaries. But in a character-focused story, the villain is supposed to challenge the hero's ideology, psychology, or at the very least say something about the themes being presented. And they more than accomplish this with Rafe. They make a big point of Rafe being a spoiled rich kid who really doesn't need the money and is instead going after the treasure for the fame and glory. This contrasts Rafe's seemingly noble ambitions with Nate and Sam's purely monetary ones. They even tie this in with the boss fight. A fencing bout, perhaps the richiest sport imaginable. You spend the whole game running from this power-hungry psycho only to discover that he's just an insecure wannabe Nathan Drake. In the boss fight, they make it clear that Rafe has been following Nate's adventures, meaning that the villain literally acknowledges that Nate is the hero. This contrasts Nate's own perceived heroism with someone who more or less sees themselves as a villain. Not only is this extremely layered characterization that challenges Nate on a psychological and thematic level, but also criticizes power fantasies themselves. Rafe's existence exposes the shortcomings of power fantasies as a narrative tool and criticizes the wider gaming's public's obsession with them. Heck, Rafe even being put in a power fantasy is kind of a challenge to power fantasies themselves. All this time, Rafe was wishing that he was Nathan Drake, forgetting the fact that he has his own strengths. He's an expert swordsman, he's a capable archaeologist, he's the owner of a multi-million-dollar company, and he's a pretty funny guy. You know who else is all of those things? Batman. The tragedy of Rafe is that he could have been Batman, but instead he was so short-sighted in his obsession with Nathan Drake that he lost everything trying to reach his impossible standard. And ultimately, that's how he's defeated. He and Nate could have escaped together with the treasure, but instead he was crushed by his own ambition. There's so much thematic material you can play with. So why does Rafe suck? Well, because Naughty Dog doesn't play with it. Most of this information is backloaded into the third act, so there's little time for all of it to sink in or develop. And well, this is probably because of the fact that the first two acts of the game were more or less already finished when Druckmann and Straley finished their revisions. As a writer, it hurts me to play this level, to get a glimpse of what this game could have been if Rafe had simply been given more room to grow. I mean, he's an adequate character already, and I kinda like how they save most of these reveals for the third act, so that way they don't lose their impact. So maybe it's just me being overly critical, but still, man, could you imagine if we knew this from, like, I don't know, the Act 2 turn? I mean, Nadine and Sam got an entire spin-off game in The Lost Legacy, but Rafe, the most complex character in the whole series, gets crushed by a pile of gold before he can prove his worth. I think this confrontation at the end of the Thieves of Libertalia best sums up the game for me. The characters bounce off each other in unique and interesting ways. The dialogue sizzles, driving the action instead of the action driving them. Rafe barely speaks, but still exudes personality. The tone is dark, but not too dark, and the consequences and tone all feel grounded. Everything just feels great. And then you remember that it makes no sense for Nate to be opposed to killing Nadine since he's killed about a dozen men on his way over here and he was going to kill her already in the boss fight. And with that one thought, the whole thing starts to kind of fall apart. In the original script by the Uncharted team, they apparently made a big deal of Nate picking up a gun again, with him only deciding to kill once he deemed it necessary. Sure, it's a small gesture, as he would have been mowing down just as many goons as before, but it would have gone a long way to make Nate's actions more palatable and this scene more believable. I still love this scene, and it still kinda works if you assume Nate is only willing to kill someone if they are going to kill him, but you shouldn't have to play those sorts of mental gymnastics for a scene to work. Uncharted 4, A Thief's End, is a game struggling against the limitations of its own power fantasy. What it does right, it hits out of the park, but what it does wrong draws emphasis to the structural problems of power fantasies themselves. Because at the end of the day, Uncharted 4 is a power fantasy, and what's notoriously hard for a power fantasy to do is to dissect its protagonist. Because at the end of the day, you're the protagonist. And the whole reason why you're here is to watch stuff blow up. To undermine this by calling your actions unjust, or to try and criticize power fantasies themselves, would be to break genre. Now, it isn't impossible, mind you. Extra Credits did a whole video on how games can fix this problem. It's just really hard and requires flexibility on the developer's part. And with all the problems with Uncharted 4's production, it's clear that flexibility was something Naughty Dog had in short supply. Despite its flaws, I really love this game. It's the most inventive, thought-provoking, and thrilling game of the series. It's because of my love for it that I spent a month criticizing it. Uncharted is an imperfect franchise, but I believe its highs make up for its lows. That what it did well, it did so well that it changed how we make games forever, and what it did poorly served as a foundation for other games to build off of. Someone has to be brave enough to be the first to try and fail in order for others to succeed. And the will to try is something that the games industry seems to be lacking more and more of as of late. Maybe the successes of Uncharted 4 will show developers that it's okay to criticize power fantasies, and maybe its failures will show them the structural flaws of power fantasies, and that they aren't the be-all end-all for game design. Maybe one day when the professional archaeologist Beach House Dad Nathan Drake collection comes out on PS64, people will be able to look back on these landmark titles and say, you know what? These were pretty good. I'd like to thank anyone who watched this far, or watched the Month of Uncharted, period. The series didn't quite get the reaction I was hoping for, considering the time I sunk into making it, but it was a passion project, and I learned a lot about editing, writing, maintaining a YouTube channel in the process. I'm probably going to take a break from YouTube for a while, considering how much work I put into this series, and I'm not currently planning a video on Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, as I haven't played it, but who knows, maybe if enough people are interested, or if I find it compelling enough, I may make a video on it. If you're interested in watching the previous videos in the Month of Uncharted, feel free to click here. If you want to subscribe, that's fine by me too. The more people who watch my videos, the more I can justify making them instead of, I don't know, playing Sudoku or something. Regardless, have a wonderful day.